The sun blazed mercilessly across the Colorado Territory desert, its heat rising in shimmering waves that made the distant mesas dance like mirages. Jake Carter squinted against the glare as he guided his bay gelding through the scrubland, following tracks that shouldn't have been there. The hoof prints were days old, scattered and desperate, the kind left by someone running hard from something they feared more than the killing heat of the wasteland. Jake had been ranching this harsh country for 12 years, and he knew the signs. These weren't the measured tracks of travelers taking the established routes to Santa Fe or Denver. These were the panicked markings of flight, heading straight into the most unforgiving stretch of desert between the Arkansas River and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. He'd found the first body 3 miles back, a man in a torn suit, his water canteen bone dry, and his lips cracked black from thirst. The buzzards had been at him for days. Then came the woman's fancy silk shoe, half buried in sand near a dried creek bed. Then a child's wooden toy horse, its paint bleached white by the relentless sun. The massacre site itself told the whole grim story. Overturned wagon, scattered belongings, dark stains on the hard-pan earth that spoke of violence swift and brutal. Raiders, most likely, the kind of men who saw a small family traveling alone as easy prey. But someone had survived long enough to run. The tracks continued north, growing more erratic with each mile. Jake had followed them for 2 days now, driven by something he couldn't name. Maybe it was the memory of his own family, taken by Comanche raiders 8 years past. Maybe it was simple human decency in a land where such things were rare as water in August. Or maybe it was the stubborn hope that somewhere in this God-forsaken wilderness, someone still drew breath and waited for rescue. The tracks led him up a rocky rise that overlooked a natural depression, where a few stunted cottonwoods struggled for survival around what might have been a spring in wetter years. Jake's gelding snorted and pranced sideways, catching a scent that made the animal's nostrils flare with unease. That's when he saw her. At first, Jake thought it was just another sun-bleached stone among the rocks. But stones didn't wear the tattered remains of a blue calico dress. Stones didn't have long, dark hair spread across sun-baked earth like spilled ink. And stones certainly didn't have the barely perceptible rise and fall of breath moving through them like whispers of life refusing to surrender. Jake dismounted so fast he nearly stumbled, his boots sliding on the loose shale as he scrambled down into the depression. The woman lay curled beneath the meager shade of the largest cottonwood, her body wrapped in what looked like a torn blanket or shawl. Her face was turned away from him, but he could see the angry red burns across her shoulders and arms, where the desert sun had claimed its due. "Miss?" Jake's voice cracked like old leather. He hadn't spoken aloud in 3 days. "Miss, can you hear me?" No response except for that thread-like breathing that might stop at any moment. Jake dropped to one knee beside her, his calloused hands hovering uncertainly over her still form. He'd dealt with injured animals plenty of times, but this was different. This was a human being clinging to life by will alone, and the wrong touch might be enough to snap that final thread. Her lips were swollen and cracked, her skin fever-hot and paper-dry. Dehydration, exposure, probably hadn't had water in days. Jake reached for his canteen with one hand while gently touching her shoulder with the other. "Easy now," he murmured, the way he'd gentle a spooked horse. "I'm here to help." "You're safe." At his touch, the woman's eyes snapped open, dark brown eyes wild with terror and pain. She tried to scramble away from him, a broken sob escaping her throat, but her body had nothing left to give. She collapsed back against the tree, those haunted eyes never leaving his face. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Please don't. I can't. I'm not." The words dissolved into incoherent mumbling, but Jake heard the fear in them. Not fear of dying, fear of living, of being found, of whatever had driven her into this wasteland to die rather than face what lay behind. Jake held up both hands, showing her his empty palms. "I won't hurt you, miss. Name's Jake Carter. I've been following your trail for 2 days, looking for survivors from that wagon train." Her eyes focused on him with effort that seemed to cost her everything. "All dead," she managed. "All of them dead. Mary, little Samuel, even the baby. Tears cut tracks through the dust on her cheeks, and Jake felt something twist hard in his chest. He'd been too late to save her family, but maybe he wasn't too late to save her. "What's your name, miss?" he asked gently, uncapping his canteen. She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to remember what names were for. Finally, barely audible, "Elena. Elena Rodriguez." "Well, Elena Rodriguez," Jake said, offering her the water, "today's the day your luck changes. You're coming home with me." The ride back to Jake's ranch took 3 hours that felt like a lifetime. Elena drifted in and out of consciousness, her fevered weight slumped against his chest as he kept one arm wrapped securely around her waist. She mumbled incoherently in both English and Spanish, calling out names of people who would never answer: Mary, Samuel, little Anna. Each broken cry cut deeper into Jake's heart, reminding him of his own losses, his own ghost that haunted the empty rooms of his ranch house. The bay gelding moved with careful precision, as if the horse understood the precious cargo they carried. Jake had wrapped Elena in his own jacket and given her small sips of water whenever she seemed alert enough to swallow. Her breathing remained shallow but steady, and her skin had begun to cool slightly as the desert's brutal heat gave way to the approaching evening. "Almost there," Jake murmured against her hair, as much to reassure himself as her. "Just hold on a little longer." When the familiar outline of his ranch buildings appeared against the purple sky, Jake felt relief flood through him like cool water. The main house sat low and solid among a cluster of cottonwoods, with a barn, corral, and several outbuildings scattered around it like children gathering close to their mother. It wasn't much to look at: weathered wood and practical construction, built for durability rather than beauty. But it was home. More importantly, it was safe. Jake carried Elena into the house, kicking open the door of the spare bedroom he hadn't entered since his sister Mary had visited 2 years ago. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon light streaming through the single window, but the room was clean, and the narrow bed still made up with fresh linens. He laid Elena down carefully, noting how small and fragile she looked against the white sheets. For the first time, he could see the full extent of her injuries in proper light. Desert sun had burned her exposed skin to angry red welts. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Scratches covered her arms and legs where thorns and rocks had torn at her during her desperate flight. But worse than the physical damage were her eyes when they occasionally fluttered open. The look of someone who had seen too much, lost too much, and wasn't sure she wanted to keep fighting to survive. Jake fetched cool water and clean cloth from his kitchen, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to handling emergencies alone. Living this far from town meant being doctor, veterinarian, and everything else to yourself. He'd treated plenty of injuries over the years, his own and his animals. But this felt different, more delicate, more important. "Elena?" He sat on the edge of the bed, dipping the cloth in the water. "I need to clean these wounds. It might sting a little." Her eyes opened, still wild with fever, but more focused than before. She stared at him for a long moment, taking in his weathered face, his gentle hands, the concern written in the lines around his gray eyes. "You're real," she whispered, as if she'd been expecting him to disappear like a mirage. "I thought, in the desert, I thought you were a dream." "Real as the sunrise," Jake assured her, beginning to gently clean the dirt and dried blood from a particularly deep scratch on her forearm. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you here." Elena winced at the contact but didn't pull away. Instead, she watched his face with intense concentration, as if trying to read his intentions in his expression. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why did you come looking for survivors?" Most people would have just reported the attack to the territorial marshal and ridden away. Jake paused in his ministrations, considering how to answer. "I lost people too," he said simply. "My wife, my 2 boys. Raiders hit our place 8 years ago while I was in town. When I got back." He trailed off, the memory still sharp enough to cut. "I know what it's like to be left behind. I couldn't leave you out there to die if there was a chance you could be saved." Elena's expression softened, pain mixing with understanding. "I'm sorry." "What were their names?" "Catherine was my wife. Thomas was 10. Little Michael was 7. Jake's voice grew rough with emotion. They were everything good in my life. After they died, I thought about just giving up. Letting this place go to ruin and drinking myself to death in some saloon in Colorado Springs. But you didn't. No, couldn't seem to manage it, even when I wanted to. Jake resumed his careful cleaning of her wounds. Kept getting up every morning, taking care of the animals, fixing what was broken. Eventually I realized that living through the pain was the only way to honor their memory. Dying wouldn't bring them back, but living might give their deaths some meaning. Elena was quiet for several minutes, letting him work. When he reached for a clean cloth to bandage her arm, she spoke again. My family was traveling to start fresh in California. Papa had saved for 3 years to buy wagons and supplies. We left Santa Fe with such hope, such dreams of what our new life would be. Jake wrapped the bandage carefully, his movements gentle and sure. How many were there? 12 of us. My parents, my brother Diego, and his wife Mary, their 3 children, my Aunt Carmen and Uncle Roberto, 2 family friends, the Hernandezes. Elena's voice broke slightly. We hired a guide in Santa Fe who said he knew a faster route. He led us right into an ambush. The guide was working with the raiders? Elena nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. They killed everyone so quickly. I only escaped because I was gathering firewood when they attacked. I hid in the rocks and watched. She shuddered, unable to continue. Jake set aside the medical supplies and simply sat with her for a moment, letting her grief wash over them both. He understood the weight of survivor's guilt, the agony of being the one left behind to carry all those memories. They hunted for me, Elena whispered. For hours they searched the rocks, calling out that they knew I was there. Their leader said they needed to find me because I could identify them. When they finally gave up and rode away, I knew I couldn't go back to the wagon. I couldn't see them all like that again. So you headed into the desert. I thought if I could reach the next settlement, I could report what happened. But I got lost and the water ran out and the sun. Elena's voice grew distant. After a while, I stopped trying to find civilization. I just kept walking because stopping felt like giving up on their memory. Jake reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and took her hand in his. Her fingers were small and cold despite the fever, and they trembled slightly at his touch. You didn't give up, he said firmly. You survived. That takes more courage than dying ever could. Elena looked up at him with those dark eyes that had seen too much. I don't feel courageous. I feel broken, like something inside me died out there in the desert with them. Maybe something did die, Jake said gently. The person you were before this happened. But that doesn't mean the person you're becoming can't be strong and whole and happy again. It just means it'll take time. How much time? The question was barely audible, filled with the desperate hope of someone afraid to hope too much. Jake squeezed her hand. However long it takes. There's no rush, Elena. You can heal here at your own pace. This ranch has plenty of room for someone who needs time to put themselves back together. I don't have anywhere else to go, she admitted. No family left, no money, no skills except helping my mother with the household. I can't even pay you for your kindness. I'm not asking for payment. I'm asking if you want to stay and heal. If you want to help me run this place while you figure out what comes next. Jake's voice was steady, matter of fact. I could use the help, truth be told. Been managing alone for too long, and there's more work than one person can handle properly. Elena stared at him in amazement. You would trust a stranger that much? Take me in knowing nothing about me except that I survived a massacre? I know you had the courage to run into the desert rather than surrender to killers. I know you walked for days without water rather than give up hope. I know you're mourning people you love deeply, which tells me you have the capacity for loyalty and affection. Jake's smile was small but genuine. That's enough to build trust on, in my experience. For the first time since he'd found her, Elena's expression held something other than pain and fear. Not happiness. That would take much longer. But a tentative possibility that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over yet. Jake Carter, she said softly, I think you might be the answer to a prayer I was afraid to pray. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon. But inside the small bedroom, Two wounded souls began the slow, careful process of learning to trust again. Him and his ability to protect, her and her right to be protected. Neither knew yet that this fragile beginning would grow into something neither had dared to hope for. But the foundation was laid in that quiet moment when healing became possible because someone cared enough to offer it freely. Elena woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting through the thin walls of the ranch house. For a moment she couldn't place where she was. The unfamiliar ceiling, the narrow bed, the sound of boots moving carefully across wooden floors. Then memory crashed back like a physical blow. The desert, the wagon train, Jake Carter's weathered face appearing above her like salvation itself. She sat up slowly, testing her body's response. The fever had broken sometime during the night, leaving her weak but clear-headed for the first time in days. Her skin still burned from sun exposure, and every muscle ached from dehydration and exhaustion. But she was alive. More than that, she was safe. Voices drifted from the kitchen, and Elena realized Jake wasn't alone. Her heart clenched with sudden fear. What if the raiders had found this place? What if Jake had turned her over to them? She forced herself to breathe deeply, listening more carefully to the conversation beyond her door. "Don't know what you've gotten yourself into, Jake." The second voice belonged to an older man, gravelly with age and concern. "Taking in some stranger from the desert? You don't know nothing about her." "I know enough," Jake's familiar baritone replied, steady and calm. "She survived something most people wouldn't. That tells me plenty about her character. Could be running from the law for all you know. Could be trouble following her that you don't want landing on your doorstep." Elena heard the scrape of a chair, footsteps moving toward the stove. "Tom, I appreciate the concern, but this isn't up for debate. The woman needed help, and I provided it. End of discussion." "Your funeral," the older man, Tom, muttered. "Just don't say I didn't warn you when this all goes sideways." Elena closed her eyes, shame washing over her in hot waves. Already she was causing problems for the man who'd saved her life. Maybe she should slip out while they were distracted, find her way to the nearest town, stop being a burden to someone who'd shown her nothing but kindness. A soft knock on her door interrupted her self-recrimination. "Elena, you awake in there?" She cleared her throat, trying to make her voice sound stronger than she felt. "Yes, come in." Jake entered carrying a tin cup of coffee and a plate of food, his expression carefully neutral. "Thought you might be hungry. How are you feeling?" "Better. Much better, thank you." Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "I heard voices. I hope I'm not causing you problems with your friends." Jake's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "Tom Brennan's been my closest neighbor for 10 years, and he's been convinced I'm making terrible decisions for every one of those years. Don't pay him any mind." "Maybe he's right this time." Elena stared down at her coffee, unable to meet Jake's eyes. "You don't know anything about me. Not really. For all you know, I could be exactly the kind of trouble he's worried about." "Are you?" The simple question forced Elena to look up. Jake stood beside the window, morning light catching the silver threads in his dark hair, his gray eyes serious but not unkind. "I don't think so," she said finally, "but I'm not the same person I was a week ago. I don't know who I am anymore, or what I'm capable of. The things I saw, the way my family died." She shuddered, setting down her coffee with shaking hands. Jake moved to the room's single chair, settling himself where she could see him clearly without feeling crowded. "Want to tell me what happened?" "Sometimes talking about it helps." Elena was quiet for so long, Jake began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant, as if she were seeing it all happen again. "We were 3 days out from Santa Fe when Manuel, our guide, led us off the main trail. Said he knew a shortcut that would save us 2 days' travel and avoid some Comanche territory further north." She took a shaky breath. "We trusted him. Papa had hired him based on recommendations from other families who'd made the journey successfully." Jake remained silent, letting her tell it at her own pace. "The attack came at dawn. I was gathering dried buffalo chips for the morning fire when I heard the first shots, By the time I looked back at the wagons, there were raiders everywhere, at least a dozen of them, maybe more. They killed the men first, quick and efficient. Then Elena's voice broke, and she pressed her hand to her mouth. You don't have to. They made the women watch, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Made us watch while they went through our belongings, took whatever they wanted. My little nephew Samuel tried to run to his father's body, and they shot him down like he was nothing more than a rabbit. Jake's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice gentle. How did you escape? I didn't. Not really. I hid in the rocks like a coward while my family was murdered. Listened to my mother calling my name, begging for her daughter's life. Tears streamed down Elena's face. The leader, he had a scar across his cheek like a lightning bolt. He told his men to find me, said they couldn't leave any witnesses, but the rocks were thick there, lots of hiding places, and eventually they gave up looking. That wasn't cowardice, Jake said firmly. That was survival. If you'd tried to help, you'd have died with them, and their sacrifice would have meant nothing. Elena shook her head violently. I should have tried. I should have done something instead of hiding like an animal. Elena! Jake's voice was sharp enough to cut through her self-recrimination. Listen to me. There's a difference between courage and suicide. If you'd run out there, you'd be dead right now, and I'd have found your body alongside theirs. Instead, you're here, alive, able to remember them and honor their memory. That matters. How can you be sure? The question was desperate, full of pain that went deeper than physical wounds. Because I've been where you are. After Catherine and the boys died, I spent months convinced I should have been there, should have died with them, drove myself near crazy with guilt and what-ifs. Jake leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. But an old preacher in Colorado Springs told me something that finally got through my thick skull. The dead don't need our guilt. They need us to live lives worthy of their sacrifice. Elena considered this, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. How do you do that? How do you make a life worthy of people who deserve so much more than they got? One day at a time, one choice at a time. You get up in the morning because they can't. You find beauty in the world because they can't see it anymore. You help other people because that's what they would have done if they were still here. Jake stood and moved to the window, looking out at his land. This ranch was Catherine's dream as much as mine. She wanted to build something that would last, something we could pass down to our sons. After they died, I almost sold it and moved back east, back to people and places that didn't carry so many memories. What stopped you? Realized that selling would be like killing them all over again. Their dreams, their plans, everything they worked for, it would all disappear. So I stayed and I worked, and I tried to build the kind of place they would have been proud of. He turned back to face her. It's not the same as it would have been with them here, but it's something. It honors what we had together. Elena picked at the eggs on her plate, appetite returning slowly as her strength did. I don't have land or a ranch or any kind of legacy to maintain. No, but you have skills, intelligence, the ability to work and care for others. You can build a new life that honors the people who loved you enough to sacrifice everything so you could live. Here, you really meant what you said about staying. Jake returned to his chair, studying her face carefully. I meant it. This place is big enough for two people who need space to heal. Question is, do you want to stay? Because I won't lie to you. It's hard work and it's lonely country, and there are days when the silence feels like it might swallow you whole. Elena thought about the alternative, making her way to some distant town where no one knew her story, finding work as a seamstress or housekeeper, building a life among strangers who would never understand what she'd lost. The prospect seemed exhausting and hollow. What would I do here? I know how to cook and clean and tend a garden, but I don't know anything about ranching. I could teach you. Horses, cattle, land management. It's not as complicated as it looks, just requires patience and common sense. Jake's expression grew more animated. Catherine used to help with the books, keeping track of expenses and profits. Haven't been as careful with that since she passed. Could use someone with a clear head for numbers. You'd trust me with your business records? Why wouldn't I? You're not stupid, Elena, despite what this tragedy might have you thinking about yourself. I can see the intelligence in your eyes, the way you think through problems before speaking. That's exactly what this place needs. Elena felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not happiness, not yet, but possibility. For the first time since the massacre, she could imagine a future that didn't consist entirely of grief and survival. I'd like to try, she said quietly, if you're sure you want the company of someone as broken as I am right now. Jake's smile was gentle, understanding. Elena, we're all broken in one way or another. The trick is finding people whose broken pieces fit alongside yours in a way that makes something stronger than either of you could be alone. Outside, Tom Brennan's voice called out a farewell as he prepared to ride back to his own ranch. Jake rose to see him off, pausing at the doorway to look back at Elena. Rest today. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, I'll show you around the place properly. Help you start learning what it takes to make a life out here. When he left, Elena sat in the quiet room, listening to the sounds of a working ranch coming to life. Horses whickering in the corral, chickens scratching in the yard, the distant lowing of cattle. It was peaceful in a way she'd forgotten existed, the kind of deep quiet that came from safety rather than hiding. For the first time in over a week, Elena Rodriguez began to believe that survival might be only the first step in a much longer journey towards something that could, eventually, be called living. 2 weeks had passed since Jake found Elena in the desert, and the change in her was remarkable. The angry red burns had faded to a warm tan, her appetite had returned with a vengeance, and she moved through the ranch house with growing confidence. More importantly, the haunted look in her dark eyes had begun to soften, replaced by something that might eventually become peace. Elena had thrown herself into ranch life with the determination of someone who needed purpose to heal. She'd taken over the cooking entirely, producing meals that made Jake realize how poorly he'd been feeding himself for the past 8 years. The ranch books, which had been a chaotic mess of scribbled notes and lost receipts, were now organized with military precision. She'd even begun helping with the lighter ranch work, feeding chickens, tending the vegetable garden Catherine had planted years ago, mending tack in the evenings while Jake worked on his correspondence. This particular morning found Elena hanging laundry on the line behind the house, humming a Spanish melody her mother used to sing while she worked. The simple domestic task filled her with unexpected contentment. There was something healing about the rhythm of ordinary life, the way each completed chore built towards something larger and more meaningful than mere survival. Jake emerged from the barn leading his bay gelding, saddled and ready for the day's work. He paused to watch Elena pin his spare shirt to the line, noting how the morning sun caught the gold highlights in her dark hair. "I'm riding out to check the north pasture," he called. "Tom mentioned seeing some of my cattle mixed in with his herd near the creek. Should be back by noon." Elena looked up from the laundry basket, shading her eyes against the bright sky. "Be careful. I'll have lunch ready when you return." The easy domesticity of the exchange struck them both. Over the past 2 weeks, they'd fallen into patterns that felt natural despite their brief acquaintance. Jake handling the heavy ranch work while Elena managed the household and books, sharing meals and evening conversations that grew longer and more comfortable each day. Jake mounted his horse, then hesitated. "Elena, if anyone comes by while I'm gone, anyone you don't recognize, you get inside the house and bar the door. Don't answer. Don't let them know you're here." Elena's hands stilled on the clothespin she'd been about to use. "Are you expecting trouble?" "Not exactly. But this is isolated country, and you're a woman alone. Better to be cautious." Jake's expression was serious. "There's a loaded rifle above the fireplace mantel. You know how to use one? Papa taught me when I was 12. Said a woman on the frontier needed to know how to protect herself." Elena's voice carried only the slightest tremor at the mention of her father. "Good. Hopefully you won't need it, but I'll feel better knowing you're prepared." Jake rode away with a final wave, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts and the peaceful sounds of the ranch. She finished hanging the laundry and moved on to other tasks, weeding the garden, collecting eggs from the hen house, starting preparations for lunch. The work kept her hands busy and her mind focused on the present rather than drifting back to painful memories. It was nearly 11 when she heard the horses. Elena straightened from where she'd been picking tomatoes, her heart immediately racing at the sound of multiple riders approaching. Jake wouldn't return for at least an hour, and Tom Brennan always announced himself with loud halloos from a distance. These riders moved quietly, deliberately, in a way that made every instinct Elena possessed scream danger. She dropped the basket of vegetables and ran for the house, her bare feet silent on the hard-packed earth. Inside, she barred the front door and moved quickly to the window, peering carefully through a crack in the curtains. 4 men sat their horses in the ranch yard, their eyes scanning the buildings with the methodical attention of predators. Elena's blood turned to ice as she recognized the leader, the scarred face from her nightmares, the man who had orchestrated her family's murder. "I know you're in there, little bird," the scarred man called out, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Saw you hanging laundry not 10 minutes past. Why don't you come out and save us all some trouble?" Elena pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her heart pounding so hard she feared they might hear it. How had they found her? She'd been so careful to stay close to the house, never venturing beyond the immediate ranch buildings where she might be spotted from a distance. "Rodriguez, woman," another voice shouted. "We know you're the one saw our faces at the wagon train. Can't have you running to the territorial marshal with descriptions now, can we?" So that was it. They'd come to eliminate the witness who could identify them, tie up the loose end that had been troubling their sleep for 2 weeks. Elena's hands shook as she reached for the rifle above the mantel, checking to ensure it was loaded as Jake had promised. "Course we could make this easy on everyone," the scarred leader continued, his tone almost conversational. "You come out peaceful-like, we'll make it quick. Otherwise, we burn the place down around you, and that takes considerable longer to die from." Elena closed her eyes, fighting back panic. She was trapped. 4 armed men against 1 woman with limited ammunition and no chance of escape. Even if she could slip out the back, they'd run her down in minutes on horseback. But then she thought of Jake, riding home to find his house burned and her body in the ashes. Thought of how he'd blame himself for leaving her alone, the way he'd carried guilt about his family's death for 8 years. She couldn't do that to him, not after everything he'd given her. Elena moved to the back window and carefully opened it, praying the hinges wouldn't creak. If she could make it to the barn, she might be able to get to Jake's spare horse and ride for help. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than waiting to be murdered. She was halfway through the window when a hand grabbed her ankle. "Well, well," one of the raiders chuckled, dragging her back into the house with brutal efficiency. "Looks like our little bird was trying to fly away." Elena fought desperately, clawing at the man's face, kicking with her free leg. But he was far stronger and had the advantage of position. He hauled her through the window and threw her roughly to the ground, where the other 3 men waited with expressions ranging from amusement to anticipation. "Been looking for you for 2 weeks, girl," the scarred leader said, dismounting with casual grace. "You led us quite a chase, disappearing into that desert like smoke. Lucky for us, some of the boys saw smoke from this chimney yesterday and decided to investigate." Elena pushed herself to her knees, trying to maintain some dignity despite her terror. "What do you want?" "What do I want?" The man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I want to sleep peaceful at night without worrying about some witness describing me to the law. You're the only one left who saw our faces, little bird. Can't have that hanging over our heads indefinitely." "I haven't told anyone," Elena said desperately. "I never even made it to town. I've been here the whole time, keeping to myself." "Oh, we know all about your arrangement with the rancher," another man sneered. "Quite cozy from what we observed. But see, that just makes it worse. Now there's 2 people who might talk, instead of just 1. Elena's heart sank as she understood the implication. They weren't just here for her. They planned to kill Jake too, eliminate anyone who might have heard her story. "He doesn't know anything," she said quickly. "I never told him about you, about what happened at the wagons. He thinks I was just lost in the desert." The scarred man studied her face with calculating eyes. "You know, I almost believe you. But almost ain't good enough when your life depends on keeping secrets." He gestured to his men. "Search the house. See if there's anything connects her to us or that massacre." 2 of the men pushed past Elena into the house while the other remained mounted, watching the horizon for Jake's return. Elena sat in the dirt, her mind racing for some way to warn Jake, to prevent him from riding straight into an ambush. "Found some interesting reading," one of the men called from inside the house. Elena's heart sank as he emerged carrying Jake's account books, the very records she'd been organizing so meticulously. "Looks like our girl's been playing house with the rancher, keeping his books and such. Real domestic arrangement they got here." "That settles it then," the leader said with satisfaction. "Can't risk him knowing about her past, even if she never told him direct." Man gets curious about a woman's history, starts asking questions in town. He looked at Elena with mock sympathy. "Sorry, little bird. Nothing personal, just business." Elena felt despair wash over her like a cold tide. In trying to build a new life, she'd brought death to the one person who'd shown her kindness. Jake would die because he'd been generous enough to save a stranger from the desert. Unless... Elena looked at the mounted guard, noting how he kept glancing toward the path Jake would take on his return. The man was nervous, constantly shifting in his saddle and fingering his rifle. If she could create enough of a distraction, perhaps Jake would see the signs of trouble before riding into the trap. "You're making a mistake," Elena said loudly, projecting her voice toward the distant hills where Jake might hear. "This rancher has nothing to do with the wagon train. He's well known in these parts, has friends who will come looking if he disappears." "Shut up," the scarred man snapped. But Elena continued talking, raising her voice even more. "Tom Brennan rides over here twice a week. The territorial marshal knows Jake Carter personally. You kill him, and they'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." One of the raiders emerged from the house and backhanded Elena across the face, sending her sprawling. "Boss said shut up." Elena tasted blood from her split lip, but felt a surge of hope. In the distance, barely visible on the horizon, she could see a lone rider who had stopped his horse and was studying the ranch through what looked like field glasses. Jake had heard her shouting and was being cautious, just as she'd prayed he would be. Now she just had to stay alive long enough for him to get help. "You boys getting jumpy?" Elena said, spitting blood into the dust. "Maybe you should be. Jake Carter's no soft townsman. He's been fighting raiders like you for years. Won't be as easy to kill as a family of unarmed travelers." The scarred man's face darkened with anger. "Keep talking, little bird. Just makes me want to take my time with you instead of making it quick and clean." But Elena had seen what she needed to see. The distant rider was no longer visible on the ridge, which meant Jake was either retreating to get help or maneuvering for position. Either way, he wasn't riding blindly into the ambush. For the first time since the raiders had arrived, Elena Rodriguez began to believe she might live to see another sunset. Jake Carter had been ranching long enough to read danger in the landscape, like other men read newspapers. The way his cattle scattered nervously in the distance, the absence of birdsong where there should have been plenty, the thin column of dust that suggested horses moving where no horses should be, all of it screamed trouble long before he crested the hill overlooking his ranch. When he saw the four riders in his yard and Elena's small form on the ground between them, Jake's blood went cold. He'd arrived too late to prevent the confrontation, but perhaps not too late to end it on his terms. Jake dismounted and left his horse ground-tied behind the ridge, taking his Winchester and moving carefully through the scrub oak that dotted the hillside above his ranch. From this position, he had a clear view of the yard and the men who'd made the mistake of threatening someone under his protection. He could hear Elena's voice carrying on the still air, see the way she held herself despite her fear. The woman had courage, more than most men he'd known. She was trying to buy time, create opportunities, keep herself alive until help could arrive. Well, help had arrived, and it was about to announce itself in terms these raiders would understand. Jake settled himself behind a boulder that offered both cover and a clear field of fire. At this range, he could drop two of them before they knew where the shots were coming from. The other two would take cover, but Elena was smart enough to use that chaos to her advantage. The scarred man, clearly the leader, was talking now, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to holding life and death in his hands. "See, the thing about witnesses, little bird, is they have a habit of growing consciences. Today you might keep quiet, but next month, when you're feeling guilty about your family, you might decide to ride into town and have a chat with the marshal." "I told you, I haven't spoken to anyone about the wagon train," Elena replied, her voice steady despite her circumstances. No one even knows where I came from. That's so. Then what's this? One of the raiders emerged from the house carrying a small wooden box Jake recognized as Catherine's jewelry case, the one where Elena had been keeping the few personal items she'd salvaged from the desert. Looks like letters, maybe some papers. Might be interesting reading. Jake's finger tightened on the trigger as he watched the man rifling through Elena's precious few belongings. The scarred leader moved closer to examine the contents, putting himself in perfect position for Jake's opening shot. Well, well, the leader drawled, holding up what looked like a letter. Seems our little bird's been keeping secrets after all. This here's addressed to Elena Rodriguez, Santa Fe. Talks about joining the California-bound wagon train, mentions the guide Manuel Esperanza by name. Elena's face went pale. Jake hadn't known about any letter, but he could see how its existence damned her in these men's eyes. Physical evidence connecting her to the massacre they'd committed. Please, Elena said, her composure finally cracking. That letter has nothing to do with you. It's all I have left of my family. Had a family, did you? The scarred man's smile was cruel. Well, you'll be seeing them again real soon. That was enough talk. Jake took careful aim at the leader's chest and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester's crack echoed across the valley like thunder, and the scarred man spun sideways, clutching his shoulder as blood bloomed across his shirt. The other raiders dove for cover, shouting curses and trying to locate the source of the shot. Elena! The barn! Jake called out, working the lever action to chamber another round. Elena didn't hesitate. She rolled sideways and sprinted toward the barn while the raiders were still scrambling for position. A shot kicked up dirt near her feet, but she made it to cover as Jake's second bullet punched through the rider who'd been tracking her with his rifle. Son of a bitch! The wounded leader snarled, pressing his back against the water trough for cover. Where'd that come from? The ridge, one of his men shouted. Muzzle flash from the rocks. Jake was already moving, using the terrain to his advantage. He'd hunted these hills for 8 years, knew every deer trail and hiding spot. The raiders were flatlanders, more accustomed to the easy targets of wagon trains than fighting in broken country against someone who knew the ground. A bullet whined off the boulder where he'd been positioned moments before, but Jake was already 50 yards away and closing the distance. He wanted this fight up close and personal, wanted these men to see his face when they paid for threatening Elena. From the barn came the sound of splintering wood, and Jake realized Elena was kicking out the boards to create a firing position. Smart woman. Give her a weapon and she'd make these bastards pay for underestimating her. Rodriguez! The scarred leader called out, his voice strained with pain. Come out now, or we burn the barn with you in it. Elena's voice answered from inside the structure, and Jake grinned fiercely at the steel in her tone. Come and try it, you murdering coward! A shot cracked from the barn, and one of the raiders cursed as splinters exploded from the fence post beside his head. Elena had found Jake's spare rifle and was making good use of it. Jake used the distraction to close the final distance, emerging from a dry creek bed directly behind the remaining raiders. His Winchester spoke twice more in rapid succession, and suddenly the odds were much more favorable. The scarred leader found himself alone, wounded, and facing a very angry rancher with blood in his eyes. He tried to bring his pistol to bear, but Jake's rifle barrel was already pressed against his chest. Drop it, Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded extreme violence. Drop it, or I'll put a hole through you big enough for a prairie dog to run through. The pistol hit the dirt with a metallic thud. The scarred man glared up at Jake with the frustrated rage of a predator suddenly finding himself prey. You made a mistake coming here, Jake continued, not moving the rifle barrel from the man's chest. Bigger mistake, threatening the woman under my protection. She's a witness, the man gasped, blood seeping between his fingers where he clutched his wounded shoulder. She saw us at the wagon train. Can identify every man in my crew. Was a witness, Jake corrected. Now she's family, and I protect my family. Elena emerged from the barn, Jake's spare rifle in her hands, her dark eyes blazing with righteous anger. She looked magnificent, fierce and deadly, and absolutely unbroken by everything these men had put her through. Is he the one? Jake asked without taking his eyes off the raider leader. The one who killed your family? Elena moved to stand beside Jake, her rifle trained on the wounded man. He's the one. Scar across his cheek like lightning. I'll never forget that face. Jake nodded slowly, his finger tightening on the trigger. Good. Then you'll remember this moment too, when he got exactly what he deserved. Wait, the scarred man gasped, seeing death in Jake's eyes. You can't just murder me. I'm wounded, defenseless. Like those families you slaughtered were defenseless? Elena's voice was ice cold. Like my little nephew Samuel was defenseless when you shot him down? Jake glanced at Elena, seeing the pain and rage warring in her expression. This man had stolen everything from her. Family, security, innocence. Justice demanded his death, but Jake wanted to be sure Elena could live with whatever happened next. Your choice, he said quietly. He killed your people, threatened your life. If you want him dead, just say the word. Elena stared down at the man who'd haunted her nightmares, who'd driven her into the desert to die rather than face him again. She had every right to pull that trigger, every reason to end the threat he represented permanently. But as she looked into his terrified eyes, Elena realized something had changed inside her during these weeks at Jake's ranch. The desert had burned away the frightened girl who'd hidden in the rocks while her family died. What remained was a woman strong enough to choose mercy over vengeance. No, she said finally, lowering her rifle. I won't become like him. We'll take him to the territorial marshal. Let the law decide his fate. Jake studied her face for a long moment, then nodded with something that looked like pride. Your decision. But if he tries to escape, or if more of his friends come looking for trouble, all bets are off. The scarred man slumped with relief, but Elena wasn't finished with him yet. But I want you to know something, she continued, her voice carrying across the ranch yard like a bell-tolling judgment. You didn't break me. You took away everyone I loved, left me for dead in the desert, hunted me like an animal, and you didn't break me. I found a new family, a new life, people who see me as more than just a victim of your cruelty. You failed. Jake looked at Elena with admiration and growing love. This was the woman who captured his heart without even trying, strong enough to face her demons, merciful enough to spare them, and brave enough to build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. The sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Tom Brennan and 3 other ranchers crested the hill at a gallop, drawn by the sound of gunfire. Help had arrived, though the crisis had already passed. As they tied up the wounded raider and prepared to transport him to town, Jake found a quiet moment with Elena beside the barn. You sure about letting him live? He asked. A man like that might find a way to cause more trouble down the road. Elena looked out across the ranch that had become her sanctuary, her home, her chance at happiness. I'm sure. Killing him wouldn't bring my family back, and it wouldn't make me feel better in the long run. Besides, she smiled, the first truly joyful expression Jake had seen on her face, I have too much to live for now to waste time on revenge. Jake Carter looked at this remarkable woman who'd survived the desert, raiders, and her own grief to emerge stronger than before. He was falling in love with her, had been for weeks without quite realizing it, and judging by the way Elena was looking at him, the feeling might just be mutual. 3 days after the raid, the territorial marshal rode away from the Carter Ranch with his prisoners securely bound and documented testimony from both Jake and Elena. The scarred leader would face justice in Denver, where a federal judge would decide his fate for the wagon train massacre and a dozen other crimes the marshal suspected him of committing across Colorado territory. Elena stood on the front porch watching the dust cloud disappear over the hills, feeling as though a chapter of her life was finally closing. The man who'd haunted her nightmares was gone, and she was still here, not just alive, but truly living for the first time since that terrible day in the desert. Jake emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Elena as he settled into the chair beside her. The comfortable silence between them had changed over the past few days, charged with unspoken feelings that neither quite knew how to address. How are you feeling? Jake asked, though he'd asked the same question a dozen times since the confrontation. Free, Elena said simply, and realized she meant it completely. For weeks I've been looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows, waiting for the other boot to drop. Now it has, and I'm still standing. Jake studied her profile as she gazed out at the ranch that had become her sanctuary. The frightened woman he'd found in the desert was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, comfortable in her own skin. Elena Rodriguez had faced her demons and emerged victorious. "I've been thinking," Jake said carefully, "about what happens next. I mean, the threat's gone now. You're free to go wherever you want, start fresh wherever feels right to you." Elena turned to look at him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the careful neutrality of his expression. "Are you asking me to leave?" "No." The word came out sharper than Jake intended, revealing more than he'd meant to show. "No, Elena, I'm not asking you to go anywhere. I want you to know you have choices now. Real choices, not just survival decisions." Elena set down her coffee cup and turned to face him fully. "What if my choice is to stay here? What if this is where I want to build my new life?" Jake's gray eyes searched her face, looking for certainty, for signs that she truly meant what she was saying. "This is hard country, Elena. Isolated, lonely sometimes. You're a young woman with your whole life ahead of you. You could go to Denver, San Francisco, anywhere civilized people live. Find a husband who can give you the kind of life you deserve." "What kind of life do I deserve?" Elena's voice carried a challenge that made Jake look up sharply. "Better than this," he said quietly. "Better than an old widower with ghosts in every corner and dirt under his fingernails. You deserve someone who can take you to theaters and fancy restaurants, buy you pretty dresses, give you children and a proper home in town." Elena was quiet for so long that Jake began to fear he'd overstepped somehow, revealed too much of his own inadequacies. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but certain. "Jake Carter, do you know what I deserved 3 weeks ago when I was dying in that desert?" Jake shook his head. "Nothing. I deserved to die with my family, to pay the price for my cowardice in hiding while they were murdered. But you didn't give me what I deserved. You gave me what I needed. A chance to heal, to find purpose, to discover who I could become when I wasn't defined by tragedy." Elena reached over and took his hand, noting how it dwarfed hers, how the calluses spoke of years of honest work. "This ranch isn't a consolation prize or a temporary refuge. It's home. You're not some inadequate substitute for a better life. You're the best man I've ever known." Jake's throat worked as he struggled with emotions he'd kept buried for 8 years. "Elena, I'm not good with pretty words or romantic gestures. I'm just a rancher who knows how to work hard and keep his word. That's not much to offer a woman like you." "A woman like me?" Elena smiled and Jake saw the steel beneath her gentleness. "I'm a woman who's lost everything and built herself up from nothing. I'm a woman who chose mercy over vengeance, who can shoot straight when threatened, who can make your books balance and your bread rise. I'm not some delicate flower who needs theaters and fancy dresses. I'm exactly the kind of woman who belongs on a ranch with a man who knows the value of keeping his word." Jake turned his hand palm up, threading his fingers through Elena's. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you, Jake Carter. I love your steadiness, your kindness, the way you protected me without making me feel weak. I love how you talk to your horses and the way you check the locks twice every night to make sure I feel safe. I love that you gave me space to heal and time to choose my own future." Jake stared at their joined hands, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "Elena, I know you loved Catherine. I'm not trying to replace her or compete with her memory, but there's room in your heart for a different kind of love, isn't there? The kind that grows from partnership and shared trials and choosing each other every day." Jake lifted their joined hands and pressed Elena's fingers to his lips. "I've been falling in love with you for weeks without knowing what to call it. Kept telling myself I was just being protective, just helping someone who needed assistance. But when I saw you facing down that raider, saw the strength and courage in you—" He trailed off, shaking his head in wonder. "What?" "I realized I wasn't just protecting you anymore. I was protecting us, what we built together, what we could build in the future." Jake met her eyes directly. "Elena Rodriguez, I love you. I love your courage and your stubbornness and the way you hum while you cook breakfast. I love how you've made this house feel like a home again, instead of just a place to sleep between work days." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. Happy tears, the first she'd shed in weeks. So what happens now? Jake was quiet for a moment, considering. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man making the most important decision of his life. Now we stop pretending this is temporary. We make it official, legal, permanent. I want to marry you, Elena. I want to build a life with you that honors both our pasts while creating something entirely new. Yes, Elena said without hesitation. Yes, I'll marry you. But I have one condition. Jake raised an eyebrow. What's that? Elena's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face. I want to be married here on the ranch, at sunset, with the mountains as our backdrop. No fancy church or elaborate ceremony. Just us, a preacher, and the land that brought us together. Jake's answering smile was equally bright. I think that can be arranged. Tom Brennan knows a circuit preacher who makes rounds through these parts. Good man, not too fond of long sermons. Perfect. Elena leaned back in her chair, feeling lighter than air. Jake? Yeah. When I was dying in that desert, I prayed for a miracle. I thought I was asking for rescue, for someone to save my life. Elena looked out at the ranch that had become her world, then back at the man who'd become her future. I didn't realize I was actually praying for you. Jake reached over and pulled Elena from her chair into his lap, holding her close as the sun began to set over the Colorado Territory mountains. Funny thing about prayers, he murmured against her hair. Sometimes they get answered in ways we never expected. Elena settled into his embrace, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his chest, how right this felt after so much that had been wrong. Do you think Catherine would approve? Of us, I mean. Jake considered the question seriously. Catherine wanted me to be happy. She used to worry that if something happened to her, I'd shut myself away and forget how to live. I think she'd be grateful to you for bringing me back to life. And your boys? Thomas and Michael? They'd have loved you, Jake said with certainty. You've got the same fierce protectiveness toward the people you care about that Catherine had. They'd have recognized that in you right away. Elena tilted her head back to look at Jake's face. I want to visit their graves before we're married. I want to introduce myself properly, ask their blessing. Jake's eyes grew suspiciously bright. They'd like that. They're buried on the hill behind the house, under the big oak tree. Catherine always said it was the prettiest spot on the ranch. Then that's where we'll start our married life, with their blessing and the promise that we'll honor their memory and how we love each other. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake and Elena sat wrapped in each other's arms, planning their future and marveling at the journey that had brought them together. Neither had been looking for love when their paths crossed in the desert, but sometimes the best gifts were the ones you never thought to ask for. The woman who had once waited 3 weeks for a ghost husband had found something far better, a real man who loved her exactly as she was, in a home where she could finally stop running and start living. 2 months later, Elena stood at the window of what was now truly her home, watching Jake lead a magnificent Palomino mare into the corral. The horse was his wedding gift to her, a gentle, intelligent animal he'd spent weeks training specifically for her use. Tomorrow she would become Elena Carter, and the transformation felt as natural as breathing. The circuit preacher had arrived that morning, a weathered man named Reverend Matthews who'd married more couples under open skies than in formal churches. He'd taken one look at Jake and Elena together and pronounced them already wedded in every way that matters to the Almighty. Elena had visited Catherine and the boys' graves the previous evening, kneeling beside the simple headstones as the sun set behind the mountains. She'd spoken to them as if they were old friends, telling Catherine how much she loved Jake, promising the children that she would help keep their father happy and safe. The wind through the oak tree branches had sounded almost like whispered blessings. Nervous? Tom Brennan's wife Sarah asked, entering the bedroom with Elena's wedding dress draped over her arms. The older woman had become Elena's closest friend over the past weeks, offering advice on everything from ranch management to handling stubborn husbands. Not nervous, Elena replied, running her fingers over the blue silk dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Jake had brought from Colorado Springs. Eager. I've never been so certain of anything in my life. Sarah smiled as she helped Elena into the dress, noting how it brought out the gold flecks in her dark eyes. Jake's been pacing the front porch for an hour like a caged mountain lion. Man's more nervous about marrying you than he was about facing those raiders. Elena laughed, the sound bright and joyful. He keeps asking if I'm sure, if I really want to tie myself to an isolated ranch, and a man said in his ways, I think he still can't quite believe I chose this life freely. Can you blame him? Beautiful woman like you could have any man she wanted, and you picked the stubborn rancher who lives 20 miles from nowhere? Sarah's expression grew serious. Of course, those of us who know Jake understand why. He's the kind of man you can count on when the world falls apart around you. Elena's thoughts drifted to that day in the desert, when her world had indeed fallen apart, and Jake had appeared like an answer to desperate prayers. He saved my life, but more than that, he helped me save myself, gave me space to heal, time to choose, the courage to face my fears, and you gave him reason to live again instead of just surviving. Fair trade, I'd say. Through the window, Elena could see neighbors arriving for the ceremony. The entire community had turned out to celebrate, ranchers and their families who'd accepted Elena as one of their own despite her unconventional arrival. Mrs. Patterson had made her famous apple cake. The Morrison boys had strung lanterns between the cottonwood trees, and someone had even brought a fiddle for dancing afterward. Time to go, Sarah announced, adjusting the simple veil Elena wore, the same one Catherine had worn, which Jake had offered with such gentle hesitancy that Elena had cried when she accepted it. Elena emerged from the house to find Jake waiting under the oak tree where his first family rested, dressed in his best black suit with a white shirt that made his gray eyes shine like silver. When he saw her approaching on Tom Brennan's arm, his expression transformed into something approaching wonder. You look beautiful, he said softly as Tom placed Elena's hand in his. Almost too beautiful for a rough country man like me. You look pretty handsome yourself, rancher, Elena replied, straightening his tie with gentle fingers. And you're exactly rough enough for a woman like me. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat with an amused smile. Shall we begin before you two forget there's anyone else here? The ceremony was simple and perfect. No elaborate vows or lengthy sermons, just two people promising to love, honor, and cherish each other for whatever time they were granted. When Jake slipped the plain gold band onto Elena's finger, the ring he'd worn on his smallest finger since Catherine's death, now sized for his new wife, Elena felt a circle completing that had begun the day he found her in the desert. You may kiss your bride, Reverend Matthews announced, and Jake needed no further encouragement. The kiss was gentle but sure, a promise of countless more to come. When they broke apart, the assembled neighbors erupted in cheers and applause, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled what sounded suspiciously like approval. The celebration continued long into the evening. Elena danced with every man present, laughed at Tom Brennan's increasingly outrageous stories, and accepted congratulations from women who'd initially been skeptical of the mysterious stranger Jake had taken in. By the time the last guest departed, Elena felt thoroughly claimed by this community that had become her chosen family. Jake found her sitting on the front porch steps, having shed her shoes to cool her feet in the evening air. He settled beside her, loosening his tie and rolling up his sleeves. Good wedding? He asked, though Elena's radiant smile had been answer enough all evening. Perfect wedding. Though I have to say, your neighbors throw quite a party. Elena leaned against Jake's shoulder, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. Mrs. Patterson told me Catherine would have loved me. That means more than she probably realized. Jake wrapped his arm around his wife, and pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Catherine would have loved you, but not as much as I do. Elena looked up at the stars scattered across the Colorado sky, remembering another night not so long ago when she'd lain dying under these same stars, certain her story was over. Now sitting beside her husband on their wedding night, she understood that ending had actually been a beginning. Jake, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me in the desert? Jake considered this. You'd have found another way to survive. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Elena Carter. The desert didn't break you, the raiders didn't break you, and losing your family nearly broke you, but didn't succeed. You'd have found your way to a good life somehow. Maybe, but it wouldn't have been this life. It wouldn't have been with you. Elena turned in his arms to face him fully. I used to think happiness was something that happened to you, like luck or good weather. Now I know it's something you build, day by day, choice by choice, with someone who loves you enough to help you build it. Jake's smile was soft and wondering. When did you get so wise? When I married a man smart enough to teach me the difference between surviving and living. As they sat together under the stars, planning their future and marveling at their present, Elena realized she'd finally stopped looking over her shoulder for threats that might destroy her happiness. The woman who'd once waited 3 weeks for a ghost husband had learned that real love wasn't about perfect timing or romantic fantasies. It was about two imperfect people choosing each other every day, building something beautiful from whatever materials life provided. The desert had taken everything from her, but it had also led her to everything she'd never known she needed. Sometimes the best gifts came wrapped in the worst circumstances, and sometimes the prayers you were afraid to pray were the ones that needed answering most. Elena Rodriguez Carter was finally truly home. And there you have it, the incredible journey of Elena Rodriguez, who survived the unthinkable and discovered that sometimes our worst moments lead us to our greatest blessings. What strikes me most about Elena's story is how she transformed from victim to survivor to a woman who chose love over fear. When those raiders returned to silence her forever, she could have crumbled. Instead, she fought alongside Jake, proving that healing doesn't make you weak, it makes you unstoppable. Jake Carter shows us what real masculinity looks like: protecting without controlling, offering strength without demanding submission, loving someone exactly as they are while helping them become who they're meant to be. He didn't try to fix Elena, he gave her space to heal herself. The American frontier was brutal, unforgiving, and often heartbreaking. But it was also where people like Elena and Jake found each other against impossible odds. Their love wasn't built on romance novels and fairy tales. It was forged through shared hardship, mutual respect, and the daily choice to stand together. Elena's transformation reminds us that survival is just the beginning. True healing happens when we stop running from our past and start building toward our future. Sometimes the family we choose becomes more precious than the one we lost. What do you think about Elena's choice to spare her family's killer? Was it mercy or justice? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible Wild West love stories. Hit that notification bell because next week we're exploring another tale of frontier courage, the outlaw who surrendered his guns for love. Until then, remember, your story isn't over just because one chapter ends badly. Sometimes the best chapters are still waiting to be written. See you on the frontier.